least we don't have all of the posters and all of that and stuff like that. Oh, okay. Well, they're not up, so that's nice. I guess they do need them. Oh, okay. Good. No, yeah.
Welcome, everyone, to the regular meeting of the City of Annapolis Board of Appeals for January 7th, 2020. Recorder, Ms. Hook, I'll ask her to call the roll, please.
Mr. Gallagher?
Yes.
Mrs. Azali? Dr. Chen? Mr. Walsh?
Here.
Mr. Burnett?
Present.
All right, we have a quorum. Have the members of the board had a chance to review the agenda?
Yes.
Any changes or suggestions?
No.
Nope.
All right, we'll consider that accepted. We have one major piece of old business tonight, the appeal of 18002, appeal from the issuance by the Director of the Department of Planning and Zoning of the Certificate of Adequate Public Facilities for the project known as the Lofts at Eastport Landing. I think this is our 7th evening of hearings on this, a new record in my recollection. And if it's humanly possible, we're going to finish tonight. I'm advised that the hearing tonight may be video recorded and broadcast as well as audio recorded, so keep that in mind. So thank you, Mr. Zazali, for covering for me at the last hearing.
My pleasure.
At the close of the last hearing, the acting chair left the record open for the limited purpose of giving each of the parties an opportunity to submit a survey, and each party has done that. I would assume that each of you would like to offer your surveys as exhibits and evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct on behalf of the applicant.
That is correct.
And are there objections on the part of either of you to the offer of the other?
No.
All right, we'll accept those in evidence then. Do any of the members of the board feel the need to ask any questions about any of the surveys submitted?
No.
Good.
Nope, I think they satisfied my request.
All right then, the evidentiary record in the case is now formally closed. There won't be any more testimony or exhibits admitted. After we attend a short session of other business, we'll move on to deliberations. The parties are welcome to remain in their comfortable front row seats for the deliberations, but I'll remind you that the evidentiary record is closed and we don't expect to hear any interruptions in our deliberations unless under the extraordinary circumstance of where a member of the board has a non-evidentiary question that we want to put to you. Is that understood? Mr. Rogers?
Yes, sir.
Good. All right. So we have some minutes to approve. Tammy, is it just December 18th? December 3rd and December 18th. Has everyone had a chance to review December 3rd and December 18th minutes?
Yes.
Yes.
Is there a motion to approve?
I move to approve.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Minutes of December 3rd and December 18th are approved. A couple of items of new business. We have an application for an extension of a variance granted in 18002 relating to 18 Church Circle. We've read Mr. Hyatt's submission on that. I didn't have any questions. Do any of the board members have any questions about it? Do we have a motion to approve the extension as requested?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the extension is approved. We have a draft annual report that we need to approve for submission to the city by next week sometime. Have you all had a chance to take a look at that?
Yes.
Do we have a motion to approve the draft annual report?
I move that we approve the draft annual, that the board approve the draft annual report.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 The last item of new business, we have, our rules require us at the first meeting in January to hold elections for board chair and vice chair. May I have nominations for board chair and vice chair?
Mr. Chairman, you've done such an extraordinary job this year. I would heartily endorse the support and nominate, put your name into nomination, the name of Robert Gallagher for chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any nominations for vice chair?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to nominate Christian Zazali for vice chair. Did a spectacular job this year. He'll do a great one next year.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Are you sure he's had enough experience? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right. Congratulations, Christian.
I guess.
Thank you.
All the privileges contained therein.
All right, we're going to move on to our deliberations in the Lofts matter. The last meeting I attended, 2 meetings back where we deliberated at 424 4th Street, I think we used a model that was pretty efficient. You weren't here.
No, I just want to interject. For the record, Bob, can we ask that you've been reviewed last meeting's testimony and evidence?
Oh, thank you, Christian. Yes. Under our rules, to participate in deliberations, anyone who missed a meeting has to affirm on the record that they've listened to the tape and reviewed the exhibits, and I've done that. And so I allow myself to participate in deliberations.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we talked generally about sort of an overview of where each of us was, and then we went back and hit item by item on the requirements. And as an aid to myself for doing that, as I did for the 424 case, I made an outline of the sections of Article 22 that we're talking about, just for my own use, and I made copies if anyone would like to see it. I think
Yes, please.
a couple of you said you found it useful last time. It's not evidence, it's not an exhibit. It's just a working outline. Thanks. And so if it's all right with you, I thought I'll start and give you my overview where I think I am. Now we can go around and then get into more specifics. I started with going back and reading Article 22 over and over and over again. Because based on arguments we've heard, some of it didn't make sense to me. How do all these pieces fit together? So we start out with a section titled Purposes. And it talks about public health and safety and protecting the environment. It talks about harmony with the community and so forth. And then it goes into goals for each of the types of facilities we're talking about and standards, requirements for publishing standards and written findings. And where I ended up with, it surprised me, and it may come as a surprise to others, that I believe that the adequate public facilities article has been fundamentally misinterpreted by the director and by the applicants. The interpretation that they've offered us is expedient, particularly in these days of budget cuts and staff cuts and everyone being asked to do more than they're able to do. But it results in what I think is a perfunctory application of the law and defeats the purpose of assuring that citizens are served by adequate public facilities. So let me take a minute to explain what I mean. So we have the purposes, these goals that I mentioned. And then under each specific section, we've got somewhat more specific goals. Police, for example, protect public safety and order. And then you have the explicit requirement that each department that administers a subset of these rules is to publish on the city website standards that they use in doing their job. It's not a suggestion. It uses the word shall, mandatory, to publish the standards that are used. And then another section, also using mandatory language, requires each of those departments, when they advise the Director of Planning and Zoning of whether there's adequate or inadequate facilities, to have written findings and conclusions. And we know a little bit what that means because our board decisions are required to be supported by written findings and decisions. I also went back and looked at the definitions section. And the definition of inadequacy is that the facility that we're talking about isn't adequate to serve the existing citizenry and those that will be brought in by a new development. So the standard that we've seen applied, I think, is will the facility result in burdens that will make that worse? And that's not the test as I read it. The test as I read it is if it's already bad, it doesn't matter whether the new burden is going to make it worse or not. It's inadequate. That's what the definition says, in my view. So I think the applicants and the director would say that, you know, as a matter of statutory interpretation, there's a principle of statutory interpretation that the specific trumps the general. And so under each of these specific sections for facilities, there are some specific standards. Not everyone actually has them, I think, but most of them do. And so the way the law has been interpreted and enforced is if you meet those particular things, the director of that department signs off, says it's adequate, sends it to P&Z, and you get your certificate. I don't think that's right. There's another principle of statutory interpretation that I think is superior, that says when you're interpreting a statute, if there are pieces of it that have been interpreted in a way that doesn't make sense, we should not assume that the legislative branch passed a law that doesn't make any sense. It's our job to try to figure it out, to make sense of it. And that's what I've tried to do, as I'll explain in a second. So looking back at the way the department has interpreted Title 22, they've told us in their early testimony that they thought that the purposes were just aspirational, that they didn't have to follow them. All they had to follow was the specific standards. They completely ignored the mandatory requirement of publishing the standards that they actually applied. They largely ignored the requirement for written findings of what they've done. For an example that I couldn't resist pointing out is in the letter from Mr. Jarrell to Planning and Zoning and Mr. Jarrell at Public Works was in charge of public maintenance services, water and sewer, stormwater management. His written findings and conclusions are 2 sentences. The Annapolis Department of Public Works has reviewed the adequate public facility study for the proposed lofts at Eastport Landing located at 915 Chesapeake Avenue, period. Based on this review, the Department of Public Works is satisfied the proposed development has adequate public facilities under 16, 18, and 24. That is, in my view, perfunctory. Beyond that, I have significant concerns about the substance of the conclusions of the various departments on a number of the 9 facilities that we're looking about. The ones that particularly troubled me were police, recreation, stormwater, traffic, non-auto, and harmony with the neighborhood, which isn't one of the 9, but it's part of the purposes. And I think we all ought to talk about those. So where does this lead me? Where I think it leads me, and of course I look forward to hearing from each of you, is my recommendation at this point in our discussion, would be to recommend that we remand the application to the Director of Planning and Zoning for him to return the constituent parts to the appropriate departments with our instructions that they can't ignore the purposes. They have to publish the standards that the law requires them to publish. And I think it's the purpose of that publication rule to adopt, you know what, the specific standards at the beginning of each section of specific standards, it says, the standards under this facility shall include but not be limited to. So with instructions to draft those standards, including whatever's in there, but not limited to those, and fleshing them out with the purposes of the statute in mind. And with those kinds of instructions and with notice of the specific issues that each of us raise and come to consensus on as we talk about the specific facilities. So
I want to interject there if you allow.
well, I'm done actually.
Okay.
Last comment. One of the instructions would be for the different departments to satisfy themselves that the plans that are proposed and approved with the conditions, any conditions that are proposed and approved, can be completed without obstruction as a result of the 14-foot buffer strip. That's my piece. As senior and vice chairman, you're on.
I will start with your second point first, that each of the criteria, water, sewer, police, parks and recs, should absolutely be tested. And do we agree with those relevant department heads who have initially said they met adequate public facility, reaffirmed it in testimony and evidence, submission of some evidence at least here during this case? I do have strong feelings about remanding it back for the purpose of complying with 2802.010. How many adequacy of public facility certifications have been issued with the process that exists?
Yeah, I don't know.
So here's what I'm saying. Here's what I want you to hear. Are we saying that every decision that we've made and that the planning department has made up until this point needs to be revisited?
No, we're saying it's never too late to stop making a mistake.
I hear you, okay? And that may be a path that this board champions because it is principally our responsibility when adequacy of public facility becomes a question for us to.
Yeah, no, I don't think it does. I think we're ruling in this case and that most of those projects are already built anyway.
I understand. But we're so far down the submission of evidence, the presentation, the testimony by experts, testimony, opinion, that there's nothing that the various department heads at this point could put in a documentary form that we wouldn't have already an abundance more information presented to us and available to us at this moment. What more could they put in a form? And we have no right to tell them what that form is. We have issued plenty of orders, no less succinct than the department head who issued the one that you just read. And that is our documentary, sorry, I'm losing the standard there, written findings and conclusions.
Yeah, I mean,
I get you that the magnitude of the cases may vary, that we may do that on the repurpose of a mailbox in a questionable proximity to the property line. However, we do not set the standard for a documentary, for written findings and conclusions by the various department heads. Only the legislator or the executive branch can tell who the people who are the civil servants what is the standard for written finding and conclusion. Is that email satisfy in the broadest interpretation, in the most liberal, relaxed interpretation of written findings and conclusions? Does that email satisfy?
I don't think it does.
You don't think it does? I don't know that answer. I'm not a lawyer. As an engineer, I do appreciate your point that the broad is subservient to the detail. Always. Right? The general takes the back seat. If there's conflict in general, but there's clarity in specific, the specific always, you can never use the general as your argument to defend against the specific.
That's the appellant's argument.
Maybe. Okay? His argument.
The applicant's argument. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. The applicant, did the applicant cause the city's process to not be complete? Did the applicant cause the city to not publish the standards to which the adequacy of public facility will be judged on the website? Or did the applicant simply go through a process that has been used for time immemorial within the city, get a certificate issued in writing by all the departments head who came here, testified that it was not issued in error?
Assume that's right. Assume that's true.
If I can weigh in, I think my mindset is similar to Christian's, where it's I agree with you that the process and the formalities that are supposed to be followed aren't being followed by the department heads in publishing what the criteria and how they're going to get to their end result. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. That being said, the cursory, summary or 2 sentences of what they're doing, they are checking that box of they're giving their opinion. And my concern with the remand is exactly what Christian just said, which is they couldn't possibly give us any more detail than we've heard over the past 7 hearings. So I don't know. I think the process needs to be fixed, but I don't think that's our job to fix the process and what's done today against this case. I certainly share your concerns with the problems we have now that have come to light that are very clear, but we've heard 7 nights, 4 to 5 hours per night, multiple expert witnesses. We are in the granular as we can possibly be in terms of the details as to whether the criteria were met. And I think it's our responsibility at this point to take the evidence that we've heard and apply it to the standards, not go back and fix the process that is clearly flawed, to say the least.
I will also offer this. There is benefit, and this is not to the part about issuing written findings and conclusions. The standards to which determination of adequate facility shall be determined, without sounding redundant, that is wholly fuzzy, right? It's not clear. But there is advantage. There is distinct and beneficial advantage to it not being entirely clear, right? Because every scenario, under every circumstance, under every period of time between when one set of rules are adopted and approved and the next set cannot possibly account for every scenario to which a developer or an applicant or a citizen may need to have some part of the city code interpreted and judged on by a department head. And the long-standing experience, judgment, case history, fairness, how it's been applied has got to come into play. We can't say you must have a 10-inch pipe at the nearest corner for 112 apartments with each square. The book would fill this room, right? So there is the professionals. That I think that's where you default back to the department heads. Each department head has a principal responsibility to which they serve the citizens, whether it's Parks and Recs, Public Works, fire, police. Each of those departments are charged with this higher purpose. Are any of those people really going to issue a adequacy of public facility in a certified written conclusion method or a simple email if they believe that it doesn't? That's really what it comes down to.
Let me give you an example. The police department. The letter from the chief of police.
I know where you're going with this, and this is one of the few that is actually quantitatively testable, at least in principle. It may not be exactly applicable, but the number of employees per citizenry, et cetera, is at least a mathematical possibility.
Well, I mean, the ratio and the response time are actually in the statute.
Right.
Yes,
Then the question becomes, how is it applied?
yes.
How is it applied, and does the chief of police or the acting chief of police or whoever's been charged with that decision, does their experience weigh in on the type of development, where the development is, and what they think it will actually do to police response time? Does that have any bearing?
Let me give you a couple examples.
Okay.
And keep in mind that the police department didn't publish any standards beyond what was in the statute. They based the ratio calculation on the 210 census without any assumption about increases in population. The only thing they added to that was an assumed number of people based on the number of units. that were going to be added. And there was a failure. The number of units would be added by this project and the other projects in the pipeline. And they admit in the letter that fails the test. And they said, but we're not going to worry about that because some of those projects aren't going to be built. And they made up an assumption that there would be one person for each unit to come online. If you're forced to write out the standards, keeping in mind the purposes of the law, the standards would say that you've got to update. And actually, there's another part of the statute that says they have to do an assessment every year. And that assessment presumably would take into account increases in population, which they didn't do in this letter. So if they did what they were supposed to do and adopted the standards, they would have some method for updating the assumed population increase every year. They'd have a uniform method for assuming how many people would live in certain kinds of residential units. They would presumably not say...
When you say they would, who do you mean?
The police
The
department.
police department are not actuarials.
They're required by the law to do this.
Just then the city
They
needs
have
to
to hire
provide
the-
them a staff actuarial.
They have to hire somebody to do it. if they can't
I
do it.
agree. I do not disagree. But that's not the way it's done. That's not the way it has been done, and it's very unlikely to be the way it's going to be done.
It
Mr.
is.
Chairman,
Yeah, let's have somebody else check.
Sorry.
Did you finish, Andrew?
Mr. Chairman, I hear what my esteemed colleague is saying. I'm not one who believes that when you have two wrongs, you continue two wrongs. I agree with your opinion. Yes, we have heard what Mr. Burnett said. We have heard copious amounts of evidence, and I combed through it all while preparing for this hearing. And my feeling is that I had also focused on your point with regard to the police, where the letter does in fact talk about potential failure. I think that in several areas of the code, of the different requirements, they're based on the evidence that we heard and read, that they are inadequate. For example, and so relying on the competency and the long history of the people who did the analysis, I give credit to that, but I give more weight to what I see and hear in this chamber and what was presented to me in evidence. That is what I would like to weigh here.
To that point, let's assume hypothetically they did publish the standards that they were supposed to, and they did everything that the law requires them to do, and we hear the evidence here, and we can, we'll have that discussion about the specifics of it, but the conclusion was still the same. Here it's all published, we think it's adequate, but the testimony in the chamber is, let's say, inadequate. We think it's inadequate for the purposes of this hypothetical. Then I don't see, I think we consider it just like every other decision. We take what the city or the department has to say into consideration in conjunction with the testimony that we hear here, and look at it in the totality. So again, I agree with you on things need to be done differently, but putting that aside, I'm in agreement with Dr. Chen in terms of, to me, the more important, yes, it's a consideration as to what the department head says, but it's also our job as the board to take that in conjunction with what we hear and evaluate the evidence.
So maybe I should clarify. I didn't mean to say that I don't agree that they shouldn't publish their standards. I think anybody who is given the responsibility of interpreting code, the more standards, written standards that are provided to those people, the better off they are. And that includes this board, that includes the citizens of this city, applicants for permits, and so on. So I do agree with the chairman that absolutely there should be written standards provided.
Andrew, if we don't require the adoption of standards, the publication of standards that they use, if we do, they're going to publish them. We may agree with them or not, but unless they're way out of bounds, we're going to probably enforce them when cases come before us. If we don't require them to do it, every time we get another case here, we're going to have to decide whether they met some standard that is only in our minds, the filings.
And I totally agree with that. I agree they should do what they are supposed to be doing, but the point is that they didn't, and here we are at this point. I don't know how, to me, that trying to go back and make them do what they were supposed to do, I don't know, 10, 15, however many years this has been the way it should have been done that it hasn't been doing, that's where I have the problem. I agree with you, but I think Christian's point was, yeah, they should do it, but here we are, and they didn't do it, so we need to evaluate.
Well, let me ask you this thing. Suppose we forget the idea of remand. We go through each of the 9, figure there's some of them that don't measure up. There's an appeal.
Mr. Chairman, may I interject as well? I think
Yeah, sure.
so you can get a sense of where I am while
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
going through this. First of all, as to the discussion about general and specific interpretations of the law, I mean, I've been trained and through 3 years of practice, deferred the specific, the general deferred to the specific. I mean, look at the preamble of the Constitution. Who can argue with those lofty goals in the preamble of the Constitution? Yet so much is argued about those very same principles. And you require the specifics of any document that follows to kind of flesh out and create more objectivity to those standards, which could be left to a very subjective interpretation. Setting that aside, I do agree that certainly the general purposes, I don't see them necessarily in conflict, but generally that the more specific standards should be applied, keeping in mind that the ultimate goal is to try to achieve the general purposes of the section. Now, as to, I too share your concern that the city didn't follow what is required of publishing and making known what the criteria were for each department when they were taking a look at adequacy. And really thought a lot about how and if we somehow remedy that situation. What I did do was take a look at the letters that were rendered by each department head, found them, certainly the one you cited was the most egregious example of a communication that was just lacking in any substance whatsoever. But I also went back painfully. I watched the video and read some of the transcript of the testimony that was provided by each of those departments and followed the testimony that they provided that gave some idea of what process they went through for evaluating the adequacy of the public facilities for their particular specialty and use. I too am reluctant to do a general remand. And I think you were heading in this direction, and that's why I wanted to weigh in. There are parts of this that I have serious concerns about, some of the sections of the 9 that are required under the code, and some that I find that might be insufficient. But as to a general remand, I'm hesitant to do that, not because it's going to be inconvenient, so much as to what Mr. Zazali, Mr. Burnett have said already, that we have listened to a great deal of testimony. Were it to be remanded simply to have published criteria come back that essentially affirm what was previously testified to, come back here and go through a whole series of a repetition of evidence and testimony at this point in our deliberations, to me, would be wasteful, inefficient, and probably not terribly productive. What I think is a better way to go is similar to the process we used in our most recent decision on other matters that weren't adequate public facility matters, but in process, to take a look at the elements of what's of the 9 different uses that are measured for adequacy, and see whether they rise or fail for their adequacy or inadequacy based on the evidence that we've received already. And again, I'm looking forward to that discussion because there are some parts of that. To me, it's a better way if we find that certain portions of this certificate are insufficient or inadequate, to send that portion back for remediation, determination, another look by the department and the parties. That, to me, is a better way to go than to do just a general remand that really would either end up in court or end up coming back to us and going through a full and entire process that will ultimately be largely repetitive.
Okay, well, fine. I think we should do that too. And that was always part of the plan. But let me finish with that question. I think you've given this some thought, so let me direct it at you. Suppose, let's take the determinations by Public Works, the 2 sentences. Suppose there's an appeal in the case. Hard to imagine, but. And would a court of appeals reviewing a decision here that where we approved or we agreed that a facility was adequate and Mr. Rogers appealed it, would a court of appeals find that our affirmance of that particular finding was improvident because there were no published rules and there were no really findings and conclusions?
I think I tend to come down, or I think and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Burnett, but I think if you take in totality the evidence that was presented to us here in person by the city departments and the expert witnesses relating to those specific areas of facilities, then it gives insight as to what the process was that was employed, the criteria that those departments used. Now, if we find that those criteria were inadequate based on the evidence that was presented here and the witnesses and what they provided and the exhibits that are provided, I think my view is that a court would probably say you still had a rather robust record upon which to depend and decide whether the process was inadequate, the facilities were inadequate or adequate that followed.
All right, do you want to start and go through the specific? Anything before we do that?
Can I just make one last comment?
Sure.
Mr. Gutwald, in his testimony, did say that the standard that his department used was not to make it worse. He
Right.
said that,
Right.
not to make it worse. And that has resonated in my brain as I've gone through all the evidence. I don't know if, generally speaking, that is their standard.
It seems like it is, but I think as we go through the specific facilities, we'll see that whether or not that's the test they use, it's only important in a couple of them.
To add to that, I agree, that resonates with me too, and frankly, it rankled me. Specifically, the record shows that I asked a question of the planning department relative to traffic impact, relative to one of the intersections on Chesapeake Avenue at Americana, and asked the hypothetical of left-handed turns coming out of there, things of that nature, and a dedicated left-hand turn would make it no worse there. I found that frankly rankling to me. So as we go through this, that's not a standard I necessarily will adhere to.
So let's go through them.
Yep.
And as we go through them, let me ask you to keep in mind that at the end, whether it would make sense, if there's the ones where there's a consensus that they did it wrong, would it make sense to remand those for them to adopt standards? So think about that as we go through them. So starting from the top, fire and rescue. I think they get a pass. I think it's horrendous situation that the fire chief can say they've got adequate EMS facilities based on a sprinkler exception. But I can't even come up with an argument that would require them to do anything differently. It's presumably a flaw in the legislation. Anyone disagree with me? So
No, I agree. I find it really lacking, but also that it's a matter that has to be corrected by the legislative body, that, it
So
complies.
They get a pass on.
They get a pass on that.
Well, let's be clear. They don't get a pass. They've met the standard.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Sorry. Police. Sounds like you spent at least as much time as I did reviewing that one. Would you like to start on that?
Yeah, I did. I was very concerned by the letter and the language in the letter. I don't find the use of the 2010 census to be sufficient, to be adequate. I do think that it is something that can be quantitated, that development that has occurred between, I think the letter was dated 2018. I think it was 2018. So presumably you would be able to quantitate what the actual numbers are and not rely solely on the 2010 and then adding one person per unit.
Who else?
This is for me is a more slightly more nuanced and tricky one, right? Because how many police are hired are sort of mandated in the budget, right?
That's right.
This is a budget question. Right. So, is the dog wagging the tail here, or is the tail wagging the dog? When we does the hiring of police officers happen digitally, meaning, or is it purely analog? Is every time somebody builds a house, do we hire 0.5 of an officer, right? Like how do we keep this forever in compliance?
The rules require an annual assessment of where we are. Mm-hmm. So if they did it annually and made some estimate of increase, I'd be happy with that. The result of that would be that every other year or two, they'd have to tell the mayor and that they need another policeman, and that would have to go in the budget.
And then what if the next year the population drops? Do we fire one?
They can at some point, if that's the case, but I don't think it's been the case.
Because my expertise is hundreds of miles from police and fire, most police response, and that Mr. Schuman and the sergeant of the community services, Amy Menendez, confirmed in testimony that the facilities are adequate and that the response time would not fall below they stood here under oath as experts saying that they're not going to fall below the necessary requirement.
Well, I heard.
Are we saying they were not being truthful?
No, I heard the testimony, same testimony you heard.
Okay.
And what I heard was that I applied the test that's in the statute, the 3.2, and in doing that, I made some assumptions that I thought were reasonable that I personally don't believe are reasonable because there's no adjustment for annual increases. If I was asked to do that job, I would have annual increases. The reasons why they wouldn't want to do that are clear because of the budget pressures.
And the code does speak to the budget, right?
Right.
And so I look at the written letter, and to me, the doubt that I interpreted the testimony the way you did, Mr. Chairman, partly because of the doubt that's written in the letter.
Yeah, the letter says we could fail. We do fail, but we're going to ignore the failure because we don't really expect those projects to be completed. Even though the statute in the standards that are there says you have to take into account the units that are in the pipeline. And it doesn't say assume one person. It doesn't say, so that's an assumption they made up. What assumption would you take? You'd say at least two people, right?
Again, this board in the execution of its duties applies the standard of we take all of the hard evidence and we put it in the ninja with the testimony and take it all and apply the appropriate weight and say, okay, I understand that the code says we shall consider. What does that mean? Consider. Does it mean think about it, reflect upon it?
What consider you talking about?
Well, account for future pipeline projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Account for. This is one that I would not fight remanding back to the department and say, we do not love your calculations. Redo it and tell us if you still think it meets adequacy of public facility.
Taking into account the purposes.
Yeah.
Where are you guys?
I mean, I'm a soft, on that. I still apply a lot of, I still give a lot of weight to whether looking the sergeant and the person who does this for a living thinks this represents a problem to the city of Annapolis, right? Looking them in the eye and saying, do you think this represents a threat to the city of Annapolis? And when they say no, I sort of take the numbers and go, okay, I trust them. I want to believe them.
I think I tend to agree with Mr. Zazali on this. Like you, Mr. Chairman, I listened to the testimony. I was here for Sergeant Maiguez for her testimony. Did read the letter and found that an odd passage. Also, the questions that were asked of her relating to how you determined the 3.2 ratio. Was it active duty officers, positions? How was it? That wasn't quite clear either.
Well, I think the law says in the budget.
Yeah,
And that's
in the budget.
That's what they did.
But then I think, well, it does.
Right.
There were some questions that came as a result of that.
In the budget.
Right.
Yeah, and, I knew it was based on the 2010 census, and, but as Mr. Zazali said, I took as an article of faith the fact that the police sergeant is testifying not only that are they at the ratio that's prescribed in the code, but also that the response times, which are the most important thing to me of what's in here, that the response times fall within what's allowed, what the code requires. So I get what you're saying, and hearing you and your analysis of that certainly gives me room for thought on that. But my initial, I was willing to find this adequate, but if it went back and we were to receive a specific set of criteria or that it's going to be updated annually, I'm fine with that too.
Andrew?
I'm on the same page with Mr. Walsh and Mr. Zazali.
I'm reluctant to say my next sentence, but I'll say it anyway. I wouldn't think if we get through the rest of them, and that was the one that we felt was not quite satisfactory, I would not find it enough to deny. Right. You know what I mean? Like, it's in there. It's part of the sauce, but it's not the entree. And
Mr. Chairman, I feel that It's not soft. This is a standard. It's a clear standard in the code. We have something to go by, which isn't always the case. And there is an opportunity to do an analysis to see where we stand relative to the code, taking into account the 2010 census and what has been built since. This is an opportunity for the board to ask for some hard data, and that can be provided. It's not like some amorphous request.
Okay. Anyone have anything else they want to add on police? Public maintenance. We heard an awful lot of evidence on this. I mean, the fact that there are documents and evidence that at some point show some confusion as to whether trash and snow removal are going to be private or public doesn't cut much weight with me. I take Public Works at their word when they say they can handle the streets, the road maintenance, and it's pretty clear to me that snow and trash is going to be private, so that's really not
Right.
an issue. So I'd be inclined to say that they satisfied the
Yep.
burden on this one.
Agreed.
Agreed.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, that it is the commercial and the recyclable trash that's going to be picked up by a private contractor, and it's going to be the, I forget how it's called, but basically the 98 roller trash barrels are going to be picked up by the city.
I don't think that.
That was my understanding after going through all the
That
documents.
wasn't
That wasn't my understanding.
No.
I heard testimony that while there may have been some discussion, that somebody affirmed that it was all
going to be all
private.
private.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I apologize.
I believe, and I watched Mr. Gerald's testimony, and I believe he said that as well, that all trash on the site would be by private. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Water and sewer. I tend to come out in the same place on water and sewer. Mr. Rogers made much of the fact that he thinks some professional standards are better than others, but I don't think that's something that I'm willing to second guess the Public Works Department on. And I'm confident that if it turns out that one of the water supply pipes isn't in condition or is smaller than the one that shows on the plans, they're going to require that it be fixed. So
I mean, I agree. The fire department for underwater will test actual flow rates.
Right.
This is not subject to some.
So I would be inclined to find that they've satisfied water and sewer. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
But Andrew.
No, I concur.
I concur.
Recreation, I have a problem with. We had very helpful testimony from a member of the public on this particular one, where they took the trouble to supply a map that showed an actual half-mile circle. And as I spent a little more time on this, it seemed to me that the director of Parks and Rec almost made every assumption he could make to make the rule work for the developer rather than for the public. Even if you got the circle in the right place, and some of that exhibit showed that some of the property they counted was outside the half-mile circle, in a crow's fly's direction. A reasonable rule, in my view, would measure it by street or bicycle distance or walking path distance. I think it's not inappropriate to count the public restaurant space and patios, places that public won't actually have 24/7 access to count that towards them. So I would remand this one with instructions to come up with rules that reflect the purpose just to improve access to recreation. Who wants to weigh in on that one?
I agree with you. When I read that part of the code and listened to Mr. Trader's testimony, I had the same impression as with what relates to fire, that needs some addressing at the legislative level. Certainly, the payment in lieu of tax escape hatch to me is that provides a little bit too much inducement to maybe not be as diligent on requiring recreational space. This is going to be in this site, this residential area is in a very concentrated area. And I too was found the testimony offered by the gentleman from the public to be very enlightening. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this, as it stands, not only do I find that the calculation that was done for saying that this was adequate and met the requirements of this section of the code, but frankly, the payment in lieu of taxes is an insult. So I find that inadequate.
Yeah, I would note that the payment rate for the in lieu doesn't seem to be in the statute, so I assume that's something that they determined at Parks and Rec. And with the purposes in mind, I think it wouldn't be unreasonable for someone to reach a different determination that required a little more money. Who else wants to weigh in on that one?
My only thought on that is just going around the circle here is I wish there was more of it, right? I wish there were more parks available to the citizens of Annapolis. Unfortunately, this is a redevelopment, right? It exists almost as is, right? The developer cannot make more parks. I mean, could they create more open space? Maybe, but there is a path to compliance. Right? I guess it exists somewhere. This payment in lieu of compliance exists. And if that is a legitimate path to compliance, it's afforded to equally to all developers and applicants within the city, then we have to hold our nose and decide whether or not they are doing it. If we feel if they're taking a couple thousand square feet inappropriately, well, that just means their fee goes up. There's not a non-compliance path here. They can just pay their way out of it.
Yeah.
So there's not a non-compliant, there's no dead end.
So do you object to making them pay more?
No. Sir, I do not object to them take Parks and Recs, taking a second look and making sure, even though they've sort of done it here under testimony, that they met the half mile, which may be who picked the half mile, right? Was that city council? Is that in statute? Is that in code? Again, to Bob's point about, is it walking distance? Is it canoeing distance? Is it straight line distance? What half mile? Vertical from the fourth floor? Right.
So,
I mean, again, I also am sympathetic to the fact that they are probably 3/4 of a mile from the city's crown jewel, Truxton Park. Right? There are many, many more residents who are a lot further from a park than they are. Maybe 1.25 miles. Yeah. It's close. A lot closer than I am.
Yes.
all right, traffic, I am baffled by traffic. It doesn't, unlike all of the other subsections, it doesn't have a goal. It doesn't state a goal. It talks about the traffic impact analysis. It doesn't tell us whether you need to deal with parking, and apparently the assumption is you don't. I'm troubled. If they published standards we presumably would know what the justification is for saying that a D is okay. A D doesn't sound that okay to me. No. And this is another one where they justify it by saying the 100 more units in the cars it produce won't make it any worse. It's already so bad. And a D, in my mind, isn't adequate. And I don't know what you do about that. At a minimum, you'd have to make the development absolutely conditioned on fixing the timing of the light rather than making it a recommendation.
No objection there.
So, Mr. Chairman, I spent a lot of time investigating this traffic issue because it was a mystery to me as well, in this case as well as other cases. During the testimony of Mr. Dua, I think that's how you pronounce his name, the Assistant Director of
Right.
Transportation. The code references the traffic impact analysis of proposed development document. So I went and I pulled that up and I read it. And it talks about measuring. I know the code talks about 250 trips and so on, but when are those trips measured became important to me. And this document talks about a 3-day period, and the expert who I think put together the traffic analysis, and on page 11, it also says that they measured over a 1-day period. This document talks about a 3-day period.
Right.
And then I queried Dr. Dua on the issue of peak hours, because that's also, in my mind, important. And I asked him, how were the peak hours chosen? Did you include traffic when school lets out? And his response to me was that they only considered workers, traffic from workers. And he indicated that they did not observe traffic during hours when the road is crowded from cars exiting schools. So I found that unsatisfactory, that they didn't even follow their guidelines of this 3-day period. I also asked him about, in the letter that was provided to Mr. Gutwald, it only referenced signalized intersections. And I asked him, why didn't you consider in your letter unsignalized? Because there is an important unsignalized intersection at Americana and Chesapeake, which will be even more important when this proposed development occurs.
And when Watergate occurs.
Yes, and Watergate. And his response was, well, it's not important to traffic flow. That was his response. And then I asked him about data that he suggested that there was data outside of the traffic study that was performed that was also included in the analysis. And I said, I don't see any additional data referenced in the traffic study. What is that data? And he could not answer me. And to me, data is everything. And if they can't tell me where their data came from, important data, then I find that to be unsatisfactory.
I concur, and without having to pile on, just a few more notes consistent with Dr. Chen, that I found, first of all, a lot's happened in Eastport since 2016. Certainly in the roadways, certainly in the way that people move around the city. And I'm troubled that, I agree with the condition that Mr. Smith put on this section, that the Tyler Avenue and Bay Ridge signalization should be optimized for better timing, for better optimization of traffic flow. But as Dr. Chen cited, Americana Drive, Madison Street, where Bay Ridge joins, where Chesapeake joins Bay Ridge, those all occur within about a 200 and 250 yard space. And the traffic study barely mentions them. It does a great job of analyzing 1, possibly 3 days on a beautiful day in September of 2016 of what traffic looked like then. But it's 2019. Since then, the project has changed. The planning department assumes that the change in project residential units would necessarily result in fewer generated trips. A reasonable assumption, but an assumption nonetheless that is not backed up by any further data. It is backed up by a calculation done by Mr. Gutwall after the new edition of the ITE standards came out, but not backed up by or updating a 2016 traffic study when the plan itself changed. Also, this is one of the most, we've heard it from everybody. All the parties have said this. Let me say the obvious. Chesapeake, Bay Ridge are the two major thoroughfares in and out of Eastport. As one who lives on that side of the creek and traversing those two streets on a daily and several times a day, and doing it throughout the year, things happen in Eastport. If something happens on Forest Drive, Eastport backs up. If Compromise Street gets flooded, Eastport backs up. These areas get backed up. It happens on more than a arbitrary, just on occasion. It happens quite often. To Dr. Chen's point, I don't think, again, the traffic study does, as all traffic studies do a great job of looking at traffic volume and traffic flow. But they really don't take a look at what's happening on the ground. The substance of what is moving, what vehicles are moving, what are their purposes, what are they doing? If you're observing that, school buses, delivery trucks, construction, landscaper trucks, all of these things, none of that is in any of this. I would propose that, I find that the traffic study was outdated. I find that it doesn't relate to it doesn't update to the project as it is, nor to the corridor from Bay Ridge Avenue, where it intersects with Forest Drive, to the bridge on Compromise Street. Because when you're talking about those two thoroughfares, Chesapeake and Bay Ridge, they are impacted by what happens on Forest Drive. They are impacted by what happens down at the bridge in Compromise Street and 6th Street. And there is absolutely no consideration given to that whatsoever. Specifically, my concern is Americana Drive, that intersection of Americana Drive. Right now, it serves a purpose. Right now, there's on-street parking there. There won't be in the future. There is on-street parking on Chesapeake Avenue across from Americana Street. What's going to happen to that? You're taking an already narrowed roadway and making it more narrow and utilizing it in a greater amount. The outlet from the parking garage is going to empty right onto Americana Drive. The supposed mediation of that is that there will be a designated left-hand turn lane there. So you're going to be emptying directly into the left-hand turn lane where there will be no signalized intersection. That, to me, and even by the traffic study itself, indicates that even with that, it is a rated D for level of service. And like you, Mr. Chair, I find that to be insufficient.
I think it's actually E.
E before, D after.
Right.
As a longtime college instructor, I don't know if too many kids would be too excited about getting a D. So In fact, I can tell you they don't get
No,
excited.
they all get
about that.
A's now.
I think that's right. So, for that, and I could go on for more and be happy to, but at least I think you get the idea that I find that this section and its analysis of the current traffic situation, to your point, Mr. Chairman, it was already bad to begin with. If our highest bar is that we're making it no worse, that I have a serious problem with that interpretation. And I think that the traffic analysis is inadequate in scope and out of date.
Andrew?
I don't think I have anything to dispute on what Mr. Walsh said. I think I think you're going to find it's hard to find anyone to say that the traffic is already in a good position, and E to D is not. Again, I'm jumping all over, but to not make it worse, and it's already a D. I have a hard time with the traffic. And the testimony from the department head was also, I thought, lacking, and I think there's some concerns that could potentially use some further exploration.
Okay, I think we got that one.
I'll just offer this one very brief point. Was it correct at the time of the original application? Did it meet the department's, when the applicant submitted it, did the city write, the city writes the criteria by which the traffic study will be done, not the applicant. The applicant did what the city asked, turned it in. The department had reviewed it, found it passed the standard. Now, 2 years on, we're saying it, we're revisiting it, right? So I'm personally not an expert in, we are hearing it de novo, right? That is our charge. We're taking it as if the application is on our desk today. That's how we interpret this, right, Bob? I'm going to ask for some guidance. If it was correct 2 years ago, but not now, then that's relevant.
It depends on which of the many objections you're talking about.
I'm just
It
talking
was a D 2 years ago.
the traffic was a D
Yeah.
2 years ago,
Right.
right? But, right. We read in the paper, for those of us that still get the paper, I forget how many that is, but there's a moratorium
No,
on
it was an E 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was a
To be upgraded to
up to a D. That's if you assume that all the assumptions are correct and proper in all regards. But, they're looking at a building moratorium on Route 3 or 2, right through Edgewater. There's a lot of this momentum to figure out the relationship between economic development and traffic, right? There's this, and the people who came first, right? You live in Eastport. Do you have some right because you were here first, right? That's a relevant question. Now, I don't know the answer. I don't know if we as a board put our foot down and say, you can't build that because the roads, and you have not solved, you public officials, taxpayers, have not solved the traffic problem.
Well, we do that all the time, in adequate public facilities.
In smaller bites.
You remember the county closed Mayo because of the sewer. There was a limit on it. You can't close it for more than 6 years.
Right. And I just read in another paper that Annapolis, the legislator is going into session, and each legislator has a traffic budget because there's no public transportation. They can't get here. Right? We're the only city capital east of the Mississippi that's not served by a train. Every other capital city east of the Mississippi you can get to downtown by a train, except for this lovely hamlet. And once you're here, you can't get anywhere. You have to drive everywhere, right? So that's the reality of it. So development in Annapolis, so fundamentally what I'm saying is, are you prepared to say, because we know that the roads over there are no worse than the roads over on Bay Ridge, Bestgate, and the road over by Raul Boulevard, and the road on West Street. So are we saying this board is putting a moratorium on development?
No.
I'm not saying that at all. But I do think that one of the general purposes that we are instructed to consider and apply specific criteria to is public safety. And right now, that corridor, in my mind, is not particularly safe. And if the introduction of even a lesser amount of vehicles from the design plan that's proposed is allowed to go forward, then I don't think that's going to improve. Or, to me, it's a stretch to say it won't make it any worse, and that the public safety issue may not be exacerbated. Will it be a huge threat to public safety? That's hard to quantify, but I think it will further redound against public safety.
And if I may.
Yeah.
And maybe I misinterpreted what my colleagues were saying. My concern was with some of the testimony conflicting in and of itself, the 1 day versus the 3 day. So when I'm talking traffic, I'm not saying it's a denial based on that. I'm saying that I would like some more information or for a remand on that issue. So I just want to make sure that I'm on the same page.
They can prove that it's fine. That's fine.
Right, that's my concern, is that there's some outdated data, that the testimony from the department, head of the department was concerning in terms of conflicting with what was actually written, what was done, so that's,
Understood.
okay.
Thank you. I appreciate your point.
Now, who would like to explain to me non-auto transport?
As a term?
Yeah, I know, I guess your feet are
Shanks Mayor, are you
transport.
familiar with the term Shanks Mayor?
Anyone like to take the lead
It's
on
an old British
that?
term meaning walk.
Michael, you look like you might be teed up for that.
Let me, I think I was teed up for the last one, but let me
All right.
refer to my notes on that. Actually,
Well, I can, while
I
he's,
was
if you could,
impressed by
I
the
haven't-
public testimony that, you're building this big new project,
yeah,
and you're going to basically replace a 5-foot sidewalk.
yeah.
That, why wouldn't you make it wider?
Yeah, that-
I can guess why you wouldn't, because it might cut into some parking spaces, and
Right.
then you'd have to cut off some
Right.
units, and
Right.
who knows where it goes from there. It all falls apart, but.
So, Mr. Chairman, that was one point, and then a second point I'd like to raise, which I feel is extremely important from the safety issue. And I urge the board members to look at the plan, especially C9 in this huge bundle of drawings we got.
In the applicant's package.
In
yeah.
the applicant's package, thank you. Which is that in order to satisfy the code, we have bike lanes going in, we have a multimodal transport center going in, plus we have pedestrians on a 5-foot sidewalk. All of this is occurring for anyone who drives down Bay Ridge and it turns into Chesapeake. There is a bend in the road, and one of our public speakers gave us photos where the road narrows significantly. And anybody who drives that bend knows that cars travel down, we're going west to east, Bay Ridge to Chesapeake, at speed. There's no stop sign, there's no yield sign, there's no slow down sign. They go at speed.
Is that where there's no marked crosswalk?
There is no marked crosswalk, and there's a bump out from the other side, which is why the road narrows. And you can see on the curb that there are tire marks because cars are driven because of the curve towards the curb. So according to the plan in applicants' submissions, you're going to put in a 4-foot bike lane around this curve. Then past this curve, very soon after this curve, where there is limited visibility because of the curve, we're going to put in a multimodal transportation center that is going to have buses, parked e-cars, Uber and Lyft pickup and drop-off space, and cars and pedestrians walking, standing at the bus station, trying to walk. I guarantee you that the reality is the bikes are going to go up on the sidewalk so they don't get killed. But you're going to come around this corner and cars themselves may be endangered because you're going to have bicyclists and buses and parked e-cars and Lyft cars pulling in and pulling out. Mr. Chairman, from a safety issue, it is just frightening to me. And I simply don't understand how that got approved.
Let's not forget, too, that this refers back to what we just spoke about with traffic as well. Just reminded me. I believe we asked Dr. Dua about the post office and its use of Americana Drive. There was no consideration given to that.
No.
So add to that the fact that you have the post office trucks going out of Americana Drive on that very same area of people coming at speed from around that corner. And if the plan were approved as proposed, you'd have a very tall building. You'd have canopies of trees. You'd have grass in order to meet some of the green space requirements, all there growing along that same 5-foot sidewalk, bike lane right there. I just find that hard to fathom that is a workable solution.
So Mr. Chairman, Mr. Walsh, I agree completely with your comments. You have already a very dangerous situation existing now, and you're going to add on delivery trucks, 150 cars ingressing and egressing on Americana, and you're going to put in this multimodal center into an already very dangerous situation.
Anyone else want to comment on
I agree that it's absolutely
non-auto?
untenable condition.
All right. Stormwater, you know, we had all of this controversy about the pollution, and I think we all agreed that we weren't going to try a Clean Water Act case, and that our focus was whether basically the storm drains are adequate to take whatever the runoff is from the redeveloped property. If this was remanded, as I think it ought to be, they can figure out whether what we now know about the 14-foot strip makes any difference. I suspect that it doesn't make much difference. But we heard testimony that everything's fine. The most impressive evidence I heard and saw was the testimony about where the large collector pipe discharges into the stream 100 and some feet from Back Creek. That it's severely eroded. The tree roots are all laid bare. It's channelized from the volume and velocity of water coming out of that 42-inch pipe. To me, that is evidence that is as powerful as you can get, that system's not adequate to handle what they've got now. And there had been a proposal earlier in the project to do some mitigation there, to take some of the energy out of that water coming out of there, and it was dropped without explanation as far as I can recall of the evidence. But it seems to, I would remand on stormwater just to give them the opportunity to address that. I mean, I think if they say the calculations show the pipes are big enough, I think that's fine. I don't care that there might be some other professional standards that someone else might like better. That doesn't worry me much. But it's clear to me that that pipe is doing a lot of this damage where it discharges, and that's something that can be fixed and ought to be fixed. Any thoughts on that?
I think many of these issues revert back to the standard for the necessity of the relationship between units and parking, right? Like, you could solve a lot of these problems if they weren't required to have so much parking. And I think we talk about the 2010 census and the codes that haven't been adopted. And I've brought this up on this board probably before many of you were even here. I have business in Seattle doing development, and I can build a 100-story building in Seattle, but I'm not allowed to add one parking spot. I'm prohibited from adding a parking spot. It's a totally progressive mindset.
But they've got public transit.
Barely, right? Like, it's not the solution, but they know that if they do not allow the cars, the public transportation must follow, right? So that's kind of the horror. We insist on building these vast acres of parking lots, and we can't break that circular. We can't solve our problems for runoff, for bike lanes, for stormwater, because we must have this giant blacktop sitting idle all day.
Well, we heard a lot of evidence about the parking and compliance with parking rules. But as far as I can tell, I don't see where that comes into adequate public facility.
I don't think it does either, but later under permitting,
Yeah, right.
right? Like, they drew only that which they believe will eventually get through a permit. Right, so they couldn't draw this project without parking and then try to hope for a permit. Look at all our green space and parks and bike lanes. Where's your parking? Denied.
You guys want stormwater? We on board telling them they need to fix that? Schools, I think it's kind of unfortunate, if not ridiculous, that we can't agree on the same standards as the county, but I don't see how that gives us a basis to invalidate the determination.
Agree.
Agreed.
And then the facilities that aren't even mentioned. I mean, we heard lots of testimony about the extent to which this proposal is or isn't in harmony with the neighborhood. And that's an explicit one of the subsections under the purposes, but it doesn't show up as a specific facility. Do we think that it is or is not harmonious? Are we going to make a judgment on that, even though there's no specific section that sets standards for it?
I mean, this is each of our own opinions, really.
Yeah, but three of them count.
I understand, right? But I know the architectural firm in question's work. I have found it always to be blending well with the surroundings. They provided testimony that they looked very hard at the stepping back. I mean, but it fundamentally comes back to, do you look at it and do you viscerally feel that is a nice looking project, right? Like that's what it comes down to. The shingle style, the balconies, the columns, you go, okay.
Well, let me ask a different question. So we don't have a specific section on it, but it's explicit in the purposes. I don't recall anywhere in the approval, the letters coming in from the departments or the certificate from Mr. Gutwald, that says somebody has determined that the project is in harmony with the neighborhood.
I thought we did have some
I
testimony.
recall Mr. Smith rendering some testimony as to that
Yes,
effect.
Mr. Smith gave considerable testimony along those lines.
But shouldn't it be in writing somewhere? Should someone have,
Perhaps it should have been, but it is now on the record.
is he the one who has responsibility for doing
That I can't answer. I think the department does, and he represents the department.
that? All right.
I concur with Mrs. Zazali. I've heard different descriptions of what the Eastport style is and characteristic, what have you. Maybe I'm interpreting the code a little bit too narrowly, but you have a section and a process of site design, plan for site design approval, and you have this section
That
as to
requires it
facilities,
too, yeah.
adequate public facilities. Harmony and characteristic shows up in site design, and being harmonious with the fabric of the community shows up and is never referred to again in this section. No department is assigned a responsibility to prove its certification or its adequacy. I guess with that, I again went through, as I was going through this, I was trying to think to myself, how would you, and to your point earlier, if something doesn't make sense, try to make sense of it, that the legislative branch was attempting to make sense of something. Since this is a section that deals with adequate public facilities, it would seem to me that the harmonious or the harmony would be, is this project as proposed be similar to, or at least not dissimilar to, other types of projects in Eastport that will have the demands on the facilities, that will require the same services from the city in these 9 specific areas. And as I look around Eastport, I need only look behind the current Eastport Center and the future potential site for the loft at Eastport and see Watergate. You know, they take demands on the city services. So clearly, at some point, adequacy of public facility was determined, it's approved, and it may be expanded. There's an apartment building across the street on Chesapeake Avenue. It's a residential property. The Tecumseh. Condominiums at the end of Burnside Avenue, and the condominium complexes on the creek. And they don't even, in my mind, have the same sense of design that this.
Would you say if eclecticism
Eclecticism, yes.
is the ethic in Eastport, anything goes.
Right.
It's correctly referred to as the vernacular.
So if you don't agree with my interpretation that it is harmonious as it relates to how properties make demands on the public facilities that follow, fine. But even if you think that it has some inference and speaks to design, I still think that it's harmonious because we're at a point now, those projects I mentioned and perhaps others have already been approved, and they're there, and they're a part of Eastport. And this is, if you're going to make the design argument, I would agree with Mrs. Zali, this is probably closer to an Eastport type design that we all kind of hope for than
It's
some of the
certainly
other
where the
facilities.
aesthetic is, with no small help from Hammond Wilson, where the aesthetic of Eastport is going,
Yeah.
right?
So, because there was so much testimony and so much passion around this issue, I would like to address it in our decision. And listening to you guys, what I think we might be able to say is recognizing all the views and passion on the issue. The department had reasonable basis for finding that it was in harmony, and we don't see any reason to disturb that. So,
I think you're nearly there on that
Yeah,
sentence.
as it relates to adequate public
harmony,
facilities.
yeah, right, yeah, okay. All right, keeping score. It seemed we have at least a consensus that there are issues that need to be dealt with on police, recreation, traffic impact, traffic, non-auto, and stormwater. And do we, at this point, have a consensus that a good way to deal with that is to send those back with specific reference to the issues that we've mentioned around the bench this evening?
Yes, that's fine by me. So those that we seem to have had a consensus that meet adequacy standards
Yeah.
are set aside.
Pass.
And
Sorry,
considered
don't want
passed.
to use the word pass again. Satisfy.
Right. So,
Satisfied.
so for my clarity, when you say we're remanding it back, we are actually at that point acting as the planning department. We're making the determination that the application did not.
Yeah.
Right.
We're not denying it.
Right.
We're saying your application, as our role, as empowered by the city to act as the planning department, we're not adjudicating here. We are sending it back for more information.
We're giving you a mulligan.
Zins. Okay. I mean, I don't necessarily feel as passionately about all of them as some of the other board members. There are one or two that, since it is going back, I will get behind it.
Well, I do read 2226.020 as if there is a determination of inadequacy of one or more of the facilities in the chapter, and if no mitigation plan has been submitted by the applicant in accordance with the provisions of 2228, Director of Planning and Zoning, that would be us, shall issue to the applicant a denial of the application for certificate, or upon request of the applicant, place the proposed project on a waiting list established and maintained by the department in consultation with applicable departments, and as facilities become adequate in regard to the proposed project on the waiting list, because the adequacy standards have been satisfied, and so on. So since we are acting as the planning department, we're giving the applicant the opportunity to mitigate.
Yeah, and we could follow that, but I don't, and have an implicit denial, but I don't think we have to.
Okay.
I think we can say, we're setting aside the certificate and asking you to redo it, agreeing that several are satisfied, but asking you to revisit the ones we have problems with.
So, Mr. Chairman, what are the mechanics for this body to determine whether the new revised supplemental calculations and information
Well,
are enough to make a
the
determination?
director is going to have a redo. Will or won't issue another certificate, and if there's appeal, we'll see it again. If there isn't, we won't.
So, okay.
Or another alternative, I guess, would be to sort of retain jurisdiction and make them come back for our approval, but I don't have much enthusiasm for that.
Because my only, and I'm as not a legal expert here, or even, were we not afforded through these last 7 hearings the opportunity to ask for what information we thought was lacking? Was that not the appropriate place to do that?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is an adversary proceeding where the parties present the evidence and you do what you're going to do based on the evidence.
And that's what I thought. I mean, because this was the
We don't have
appellant's case,
investigators.
not the applicant's case.
And we don't really have the expertise to do
I
that.
understand, right? I mean, because there were points along this arc of this where I felt both, and we're getting a little, now we're sort of into the just open dialogue part of this conversation,
Yeah, it's
where
fine.
I felt the applicant, in their vast experience, sensed that they did not have enough on the table, right? But I could sense, this is only my opinion here, sense that they wish they had more, but didn't, right? And let the chips lay where they are. They did not come back with, they were afforded the opportunity, I should say that, they had the opportunity to introduce any new evidence that they felt in their own application was lacking.
7 nights?
7 wonderful opportunities. Okay.
And maybe I should say, just in case there was any impression given by our discussion here tonight, that none of the discussion from my point of view was meant to be critical of the work of the Planning and Zoning Department, or really the other departments. I think they were, in my view, operating under a misapprehension of what the standard is. And I have complete confidence in Dr. Nash and her staff.
Yes.
And the others, when they get this back, to do the job that we're asking them to do.
I would echo that sentiment. that
Agreed.
Parks and Recs is busy running a Parks and Recs department, not reviewing plans.
Right.
They need help.
We need help. Understaffed, for sure.
So you'll notice that we are without board counsel tonight.
Super.
I will volunteer to try to get a draft of our decision within the next 7 days and circulate it to each of you for your comments and suggestions, and see if we can get something that we're all happy with by the usual 30-day period.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
Hard case. Thanks to everyone who participated in it for your hard work. After we adjourn, is there a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn, I move for adjournment.
Well, do we need to vote on what we did?
We should probably take a
Yeah,
vote
we
on
probably
it.
should. I withdraw my motion.
So I would recommend a motion.
Why don't you call out the items that we're remanding and take a vote on it?
Yeah. The items to be remanded are police, recreation, traffic, non-auto transport, and stormwater.
And we will endeavor, are we?
And we find satisfaction of the others.
Yep.
That they've met the standards of adequacy based on the preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah.
So do we give guidance? That's your letter. isn't it?
That's the
That's the
decision. I'll
decision,
try
yeah.
to incorporate where I thought there was a consensus on
All
the
right.
criticisms. And we can tweak it with your comments.
And those, I'm gonna ask questions just in the absence of our counsel here. Is that communication subject to open records or dialogue about that?
I don't think in draft form it is.
No, it's not a meeting.
Understood.
You'll each send them to me and I'll draft.
Whatever the public part is, it would be publicly, whatever we come up with becomes
It
public.
becomes,
Yes.
the final decision is
I think
public.
that's
Okay.
All right, so that was a motion.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Just so I understand, it's police, recreation, traffic, non-auto transport, and stormwater. And you find satisfaction in the remaining items.
Police, recreation, traffic, non-auto, and stormwater, yeah.
Right.
All right, motion to adjourn,
So moved.
second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
I've been dying to hear from you, Mr. Rogers. What have you got?
Where the